Hello and welcome back to the evaluation series, and this is going to be basically the start of the Cloud Automation Appliance, and I am going to backtrack. Like I said, I jumped into the deep end. I wanted to finish up this workflow with this new side, and I think I will come back and modify this workflow still and add in a number of different things that we're going to get to later on in this series. So we're going to leave that there for now. But what I wanted to cover effectively is the start of this cloud automation. And some of the things you're going to want to do before you get started, just to make sure you have backups and everything else, and also to ensure that, as you're deleting things, if you need to recover it, you can. So the very first thing is, if you can log into your cloud automation, which you should have been able to once we've done this, first thing to do is look up here in the menu. So in the node red in the right-hand corner, there's what they call hamburger menus, 3 slashes. Click on it, go down to the export. You're going to want to click on the all flows and then copy to clipboard. That's it. That's going to copy all of these workflows and tabs and all of the data necessary to copy. What we want to do then is go to projects. We're going to do new, and I'm going to say this is going to be IPControl POC. And we can say POC of IPControl and CAA. The flow file you can leave as flows com, that's the default. But down here in the bottom here, disable encryption, specifically so that if we can copy it and you can move back and forth if you need to. But if you need to lock it down in production, of course you can. I suggest you don't initially because it's a little tricky to reverse encryption if you don't remember it. So here now we have a blank workflow. So we built a new project, and what you want to do now is go to import, click on this center box here, just paste everything and do import. Now that's going to import everything. You're going to see all of your different changes. This blue indicates that it's pending. Just go ahead and deploy, and that's it. So, and the reason I wanted to do that is because here you're going to see that we include, and I'll just do this. There are a lot of different IP control. There's 41 plus the ones here, so probably 55, 65 different workflows, and it's a combination of IPC, which is the IP control, and then QIP, again, which is our second product. But we're going to be dealing with IP control in this particular model. So what I would recommend you do here, because that is what we're going to do, I have already done this in my other flow, but let's take a look at it here. So in this particular interface then, you may want to see all of these QIP flows and you may want to delete these. So first, let's make sure which project we're in. Okay, this is the POC, so that's currently where we're at. And then you can just right click on the flows in this node and you can do either export if you want to save them, or you can just do delete. So we'll just do delete here. I'm going to get rid of them all because I have another video series on QIP that I did for all of the QIP workflows, which are very similar in nature, but again, a little different in the way it works. So let's just do this. And if you double click on these, you're going to open up those documentation headers as you see I've done. And the only reason, again, I'm doing this is so that it's easier to navigate and we don't have to move through 40 different flows. We'll move through 22 different flows. And just keep doing this. Yeah, we're almost there. Okay. And we'll just get rid of that one as well. All right. So what we have, we go back to the very beginning of this. We should have, I have my news site here in this call out, but you should effectively have in yours, starting with the login, you should then see the sync subnets, the sync AWS, and some other commands, sync IPs down through until you get to the IPC commands, which are the IP control API specifically for the blocks and IPs and DNS resource records. And that's what you should see left in this. And then go ahead and deploy. You will see, since we deleted these, the unused nodes. And we'll see here, this is the QIP login service. So we'll double click. We'll double click it again, which will open it. And I'm just going to delete it since we don't need it and deploy. And that will then leave you with an empty, or not an empty, but a new project that has just the IP control workflows. Okay, and this is where you're effectively going to start. So now the way that Node-RED, if you've never worked with it again, I'm going to just cover this real quick. So we talked about the palettes initially. These are all, again, these are flows that are built in or they're part of the workflows that you've installed as part of different node projects or installation parts, or they're part of what's built into this version of the CAA. So these are all available to us to use, and like email and some others. And we can add things like SQLite and MySQL. There's some other types of nodes that can be installed outside of this, but we're going to stick with what's default. And what they do is in each one of these different workflows is they've created samples that you can call right away simply by calling these procedures. And then each of these nodes and workflows, so if you click on the tab and then click on the eye, it tells you what that tab is about. It tells you what it's looking for, what it'll be focused on, and some information. If you click on a node and then click on the document icon or help, it'll give you the documentation of the node. And all of this documentation is Markdown so that you can update and create your own flows and your own Markdown for your teams and others. So real easy to work with there. And then we have these flows. So to explain what they are, the login, of course, we have just to test a login, the sync subnets, and with AWS and Azure, and for the different cloud components, we have these sync nodes. And what these sync nodes allow us to do is to take two different inputs. We take an input, which is effectively an export of all of the IP control subnets based on a particular VNet or container, whatever we, through this workflow decide. And then there's a described VNets or described subnets, VPCs up there in AWS in this example, and it gets a list of all of those, and then it synchronizes the two together and generates a differences list of adds, deletes, and modifications. And once it goes through that differences, we can then parse through the list, determine what needs to be added, what needs to be deleted, and handle those accordingly by the add or the delete child blocks. So we effectively set up the different workflows using these change nodes, adding to them different parameters based on how we need to create the input structure. And we're utilizing basically native Node-RED nodes to handle all of this functionality. So like here with the net ads, we go through the setup for the ads, and we'll copy over here we'll set the payload to the synchronization for the ad subnets, and then we'll split the array, parse through each one of them, join them all together after we've done some imports, and then go to the next workflow and so forth. So that's how the sync subnets is. So each one of these then has a very specific purpose, a testing capability, and a pre-built API that you can start to work with. Now, I will caveat that AWS and Azure are going to be considerably more, I'll say, complicated because there's going to be member IDs, there's going to be roles and ARNs, and other types of settings that are going to be kind of outside your immediate control potentially. You'll need to involve other third-party teams and get them involved so that we can do that synchronization, set up an account, and have some type of credential to permit this. So because I don't have a lot of this right now, I have to set up even my environment. I'm going to hold on that particular discussion, but go through some of the other IP control module built-ins that we do have control over that we can test and look at along the way. So beginning with this, and to begin to how the tab structure works. With Node-RED, each of these tabs is considered to us a workflow. Right-clicking on each of the tabs, you can add a flow to the right, left, disable the flow, lock it. We can move it to start or end along the left or right, and then we can hide it. Deleting it, there isn't a prompt. Are you sure you want to delete? And then export. One note about this, if I go in and let's say I delete this node, and whoops, don't hit deploy. Simply leave the page. It'll reload back the JSON that was in cache. So until you deploy the change, it is still in memory. If we have multiple users logged in, performing different changes on these flows, and one of you makes a change, it's going to prompt you and tell you there's been a flow. Here's what the flow differences are. Do you want to merge that change with what you're working on? And then it updates the cache of the files. It's really very impressive the way it works in that multi-user. So it gives you the way that you can have multi DevOps working on the same or even different flows and then modifying that information. In terms of the deploy, there's multiple ways to deploy the flows. Once you make a change, you'll see that it's highlighted. So if I even move this, it highlights it with this and then shows me it's ready to deploy. These little dots on this red button indicate this is a full deployment. If I do modified flows only, it would only flow or deploy add subnet, which we modified. The rest would stay alone, intact. Or I can do modify nodes. So if I only modified this one node, I don't need to deploy the rest. I only do modified nodes, and that's typically where I stay. So I only do modified nodes typically, unless I'm adding a new flow or working in that context. Then that way, I'm not modifying other potential sites and deploying things that are outside of my particular workflow. So we talked about some things already. We talked about the APIs for importing a child block, getting the next available subnet, like this, add next subnet, and then getting a device for an existing device or getting the next available subnet or IP device and so on. So we have in the basic workflows and APIs that we were looking at earlier in Swagger, we have these nodes that are pre-built for that purpose. Now, what we've done with these nodes, and again, the reason of it, and if you can look at the documentation for these, is we try to simplify the input. I don't know, we saw, let's take a look at import device is, and if you recall, this was the simplest form of the import devices JSON I could possibly use in this case here. So what this tries to do here is it allows you to specify that if you want to use your own JSON, you can. But here are the fields that you just specify as part of the payload and input, which will process. It'll take the username, password, login, generate the credential, which again, we want to, typically do this somewhere else, but this is set to do this for the payload. And it's going to set up the credential, login, and then pass the other parameters necessary for this node, which is going to use for host name, container, IP address, type, and interfaces. Now we have this raw container function, just to tell you how that works. And because we have in this node for the login, we tell it, here's where I want to route it. And I say, route this container. This is where we start looking for data when we search and where we start managing the application. In many cases in the cloud, especially the cloud environments, and where we're doing discovery or auto discovery, where we have some very complex workflows that can go out and attempt to discover everything. In a case like that, it attempts to build the VPC. So if I go back over here where we do this here, it tries to build the VPC in the container as it's processing the data using VPC, VNet, and kind of concatenate them together to build a property that will somehow match up with our cloud and our container structure. So I say that with some, we're going to go through this some more, but as we go through this, when we think about the container, if you are passing a container name with a slash, it's prepended with a slash, meaning you're going to tell it the exact or root of the name, then you would tell it to use raw container, which indicates when I do a prepended slash of the name, I want to use the raw container and I'm going to tell it where I want to start. If I omit the leading slash on the input of a container name, this system will then try to append that if we leave off the raw containers. It tries to append the root to whatever it sees in the incoming packet, whatever it is. So it would be, in this case, in control slash whatever it is. And that's not what we want. So it's hard not to visualize it, to understand and not visualize. So I just want to point out because we are going to get to that. But in these particular flows, then we should be able to do this. So they give you examples, and the key here is they give you examples that you can work with and build on, and that we don't expect that any engineers or anybody that acquires this cloud automation appliance is going to immediately start doing DevOps work. We don't expect you to know JavaScript. We don't expect you to know APIs and REST APIs. You may expect it or expect to do DNS and IP addressing. But when it gets to this piece of it, we don't expect that. And so we do have engineers, developers, et cetera, that can manage and build these workflows. And we can take these and say, okay, now how do we take this modify address and fit it into your environment so that your engineers or ServiceNow or Terraform or other orchestration tools can send me a simple input payload JSON that I can process and turn into a multiple request, maybe a complex API, and that complex API will log in, do any gets or deletes, puts, whatever we tell it to do, and hide and obscure the complexity of that workflow from the user. And that's really the key there. So we're going to get into this. I'm not going to do all this now, but we're going to get into this and go through some of these in more detail because they are of interest to you and how you can incorporate this. So we give you all these, and this is where you want to start working with it. Now, in terms of the right-hand side, this is the debug, and this is kind of the informational debug detail pane, if you will. And in this, you're going to have different ways of navigating. You can go up to the flows. You can see all of the workflows and all of the things that are beneath it, and you can see all of their documentation directly beneath the list. So as you're highlighting over here, if I go look at the delete Azure node, and then I switch over here and back, it might change, but I can then go up here to some other node and look at its description while I'm trying to edit it. So let's say I go into here, I can see the details as I need, navigating on the side. So that's the navigation, and it's broken out by modules, which are the node modules that are built into the system, okay, and or imported. So I just want to point that out because it's very helpful when you're dealing with this. Now we also then have a local Git. So there's a local Git repository that we could then commit all of these, and we could say this is our base commit, and it'll build this locally so that it has this information available. So, if we need to roll back or restore, we could go out and say, this is our base. Any modifications, issues, et cetera, we can roll it back, testing, et cetera, and so on. However, you can also build in a Git repository using any kind of GitHub, and you can go out and set up those settings with your version branches and remotes. So you do have this option to have that type of historical and local change history. The debug we use all the time. So you're going to be using this all the time. And you have the ability to debug select nodes, all nodes, current nodes, however you want to do it. And the debug node itself is typically this node here. You turn it on and off as you need. And within those, you either have a payload, which is just the payload. So whatever's going into the next node, that will be picked up and processed. The complete message is always passed in, but it has other variables or parameters. And then you have expressions which use JSON-ADA. And there's a lot of different built-in coding capabilities that you can take advantage of to manipulate the payload and expressions and return formulated answers to the response or as the payload for the next process. That makes sense. We'll see some examples of that here at some point. And then you have some settings here to show you the flows. I showed you where you would delete it if it popped up, but you double click on this, shows you basically what the properties are. And if I needed to change this, I could change it here, and it would most likely do it globally. And then if there's anything in a dependency or node underneath these subnodes, you would see them. And then you can filter out all or none. And over here too, you're going to see a couple of additional navigations. And one of those is context data. So we haven't really talked about context data. This is a node-RED process or node-RED function. But each of these nodes has a context. The flow has a context, and the global, as an application, has a context. The context is effectively whatever we want to put, whether it's a variable, a string, an array. It can be all of the data we've ever worked on. It could be an audit log, and we use that to pull data in and out of flows, or maybe some pre-built flows that we set up as an initial kickoff that sets all of our default values that are later being pulled in. And we will use this moving through these different workflows. We'll have the flow basics that as I'm in here, I can say, well, give me some data based on this value, and it'll pull it back in. So you're going to see that we're going to use this moving around. Now, in terms of the settings, we saw where we can do the config. Some of this might give you some grid display and size and help you with the navigation, shortcut keys as you get moving around, and then global environment variables that you can again pull back into your project as you need for use in the flows. And more importantly, to show you how we did this, we transferred the whole project over by simply copying this export and then importing it. So as we work with our customers and clients, and I say, well, I've got a new workflow for you. I built one and I'm going to transfer it to you. All I do here is go over to export a copy to clipboard or download a file, send you a text file, and then you walk over and import it to your system. Simple as that, literally. And it copies that data in, and you can start picking up from that point, and we can update flows, we can create new flows, transfer it. And from here, you're going to have the ability to group flows together. So as you start to go through this process, you might find, well, there are certain parameters or there are certain nodes that are tied together that I want to use, and I want to, I should have stayed where I was at for this example, but I might want to group them together. So like right here, I might want to group all of these together and say, maybe something in here, pull it down here, and then give it a comment node, and then say that this is the add site group. And I could put in all of my text here about, how this works. This is the add site API template. Okay. And from there, then we can have some other grouping and we can do some color coding. So even here, like in the grouping, the properties, you can go in and change the color. So I can say this is now, even yellow. So I can do some color coding. That's bright. Do some color coding in here that is going to give you the ability to, kind of give you visual indication of what it does. These are grouped together by function because they do something together. Read me. And so this might just be read me. And we have flows to do that. So that was a high level view, 20-minute walk view of Node-RED, a high end without even going through any of the nodes or really doing anything. But at this point, we effectively have everything we need that we can start to go through the process. And I want to start going through some of the base flows and see how those kind of work, because these are really tied back to the API, but we can help do this through shorthand by simplifying the flows a little bit better, I hope, in this case. So that's our fifth video or first video on the CAA, and we'll go ahead and stop here, and then I'll come back and we'll get into more detail. Thanks, take care, and look forward to the next video.